Welcome to Press Perspective. It's Thursday, July 9th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. It's been a busy diplomatic week for President Lee Jae Myung thus far as he began the week with a trip to Türkiye for this year's NATO summit before flying into Mongolia for a state visit aimed at advancing bilateral ties. For more on this, I have Steven Borowiec with Japanese weekly news magazine Nikkei Asia here in the studio. Steven, welcome back.
Nice to see you. Thanks.
I also have Fabian Kretschmer with German news agency DPA here with us. Fabian, it's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Steven, let's start with the significance of this summit between South Korea and Mongolia.
Well, Lee is the first South Korean president to travel to Mongolia in I think it's 15 years. So that in itself sends a message that this is a bilateral relationship that Lee prioritizes and that he thinks is worth investing some time and effort in. I imagine Mongolia being a kind of out-of-the-way place. They don't get the leaders of big, important countries rolling through all the time. So I'm sure they appreciate this, and I'm sure Lee has received a warm welcome there. Mongolia also has large deposits of rare earth minerals, we believe. I think there are varying estimates as to just how much they have and of what kinds. But as we've been talking a lot about in recent weeks, South Korea is really going big on its ability to produce high-tech items such as semiconductors and physical AI and data centers. This is all things that are very much in the headlines here and something that Lee's administration is working very hard on. So I imagine that it makes sense for Lee to be solidifying relationships with countries that are in a place to provide some of this stuff and are potentially, kind of get in on the ground floor as Mongolia continues to explore its reserves that much more. And from the Mongolian perspective, I mean, the old story of Mongolia is a little bit similar to Korea, and this country that's positioned right in between these larger powers. Mongolia's history is characterized by being kind of pulled in between Russia and, formerly the Soviet Union and China, and kind of like balancing those relationships. And I think South Korea has always stood out to them as a potentially attractive partner in that this is a more technologically advanced country, a more economically advanced country, a country that's like managed to leverage its strengths and become a major exporter. And so I think from Ulaanbaatar's perspective, South Korea comes without some of the historical baggage that the relations with China and Russia do, and also is an example of a developmental success that they might like to emulate. So a lot of fertile ground on both sides, I think.
Right. Fabian, what are your takeaways with regard to Seoul's ties with Ulaanbaatar?
Yeah, actually, the ties are pretty apparent. If you visit Ulaanbaatar, it's very visible how much South Korea has influenced the capital. I mean, you walk through the streets where new apartment projects are built by South Korean chaebol. You go through the streets and see a lot of Korean restaurants opening up. In the coffee shops, K-pop is blaring through the speakers. Convenience stores are mostly run by Korean chains, and the products in the supermarkets are also often from South Korea. So that is very obvious, but also for young Mongolians, South Korea is quite an attractive country if they want to get education abroad or also work abroad. And actually the number of Mongolians in South Korea is increasing. You can actually see that in some suburbs of Seoul, like a lot of Mongolian restaurants are opening up and communities are spreading. So the ties are developing quite organically, and Mongolia also has what South Korea needs, namely minerals, copper mines, for example. I mean, all those resources that you also need for semiconductors. And there's actually one more aspect that I find interesting. Mongolia is one of the few democracies here in the region that has ties to North Korea as well. And I mean, it could potentially play a role in terms of a neutral ground to mediate between North and South Korea. I mean, that's of course speculation, but could be maybe in the back of Lee Jae Myung's mind, because he really wants to get engagement with North Korea.
Right. And President Lee Jae Myung's state visit to Mongolia, Stephen, follows his presence at this year's NATO summit in Turkey that began on Tuesday. What do you believe makes his attendance at this summit important this year?
I think Lee probably on a symbolic level, he wants to communicate to NATO that South Korea is a reliable partner, an engaged partner, a partner who's really just kind of keeping abreast of what's happening in, the parts of the world that NATO is responsible for, particularly the kind of eastern flank of Europe, the environs of Russia. The Ukraine war has obviously created a lot of opportunity for South Korean defense exporters, and Lee, I think, just wants to demonstrate that this is, a part of the world that South Korea considers to be, very relevant to its own affairs. And so while he was there, I thought it was interesting that he talked about upgrading South Korea's defense relationship with the NATO sphere and not having it not just be characterized by arms exchanges, but also by joint research and joint production. Kind of collaborating directly and not having this be, a transactional or just a business relationship, but that he sees there as being, chance for collaboration that would bring the two sides together and allow them to maybe find, shared answers to shared problems. The context of this particular visit is also, I know we'll get into this more later, but Canada choosing Germany as its preferred bidder for its submarine project. Canada choosing, a European country and kind of, deepening its ties to that part of the world. I wonder if, part of Lee's intentions on this trip is to, kind of reduce the perception of South Korea as something that exists outside of the NATO sphere and kind of more deeply integrate and kind of more, show that if you're choosing ties with South Korea, you don't have to choose to lessen your ties with NATO. Like it's kind of all part of this same sort of sphere of influence. So.
Right, and speaking about sphere of influence, with regard to security, Fabian, how relevant was the NATO summit this year, do you think?
Well, actually, coincidentally, one of the most prominent German security experts visited Seoul a couple of days ago, and I asked him how he would frame the NATO summit, and he didn't mince his words. He said, I'm expecting it to become a boot-licking summit. And, what he meant is that all NATO countries want to keep Trump happy and basically please him rhetorically to keep the US inside NATO and not have him lash out at all the countries. I mean, we get to that point later. Actually, Trump and other NATO countries, there are still a lot of frictions. But in terms of the most important security issues, I would say Ukraine still ranks first. I mean, NATO, of course, committed again to continue support Ukraine in its efforts to defend against Russia. And that is really necessary because the war has escalated quite a bit in the lead up to the NATO summit. Russia has increasingly attacked Kiev, so the capital of Ukraine, and those targets were often residential areas. So it's really quite tragic. On the other hand, Ukraine is targeting increasing oil infrastructure in Russia inwards, so basically taking the war also further to Russian territory. And for Iran, the war, we technically still have a truce, but again, there have been quite severe attacks. So the US is accusing Iran of having attacked oil tankers around the Strait of Hormuz. Then, US launched a series of quite serious attacks. The General Secretary of NATO, Mark Rutte, he defended those attacks. He said they are necessary and basically said or backed Trump. Whether that was rather a tactical move or it was genuine, we don't know. But so there's a lot of security issues, and that's why actually I would say NATO is still very necessary, maybe more necessary than ever.
Right. On the sidelines of the NATO summit, Steven, top diplomats of South Korea, the US and Japan sat down for talks as well. What was on their agenda?
The one takeaway that I saw in the foreign media reporting from the meeting was that they agreed on the deployment of small modular reactors in the Asia Pacific and beyond. I think it's one of those agreements where it's the details of it have not been totally fleshed out yet. It's more like they've agreed to make further efforts in this direction. So, I mean, that's probably a message that I think will receive a pretty warm welcome in all three of those countries. The mood seems to have shifted for the most part in both South Korea and Japan that in favor of trilateral cooperation. That like these three countries are, despite whatever difference they might have in their domestic politics, they're stronger when they work together. They have quite a few shared challenges and shared objectives. So this seems to be a kind of one more step towards solidifying cooperation on a trilateral level.
Right. And with regard to diplomatic ties, Fabian, Mr. Trump has been quite critical about his NATO counterparts' lack of support for his military campaign against Iran. He's also been quite critical about the German leader as well. Do you expect tensions to remain?
Well, just before Trump entered the Air Force One and was flying to Ankara, I mean, you could see he was in a bad mood. He basically said, I'm only joining the summit because I like President Erdogan, like the Turkish president. They are quite friendly. And he said that he's very disappointed that NATO countries have not helped in his war efforts against Iran. He also said that Greenland should be controlled by the US and not by Denmark. I mean, all those critical issues, he basically, repeated them, and that's kind of Trump being Trump. I would say he always starts with a splash. He wants to leverage his position, and in the end, I would say it became more and more friendly, even with Meloni, the Italian head of government. They were getting along better than expected. So you have a lot of friction, and interaction with Trump remains complicated. But in the end, the tactic, especially by European head of states, is that they want to emphasize the common ground with the US. They want to basically trivialize the sensitive topics, maneuver around them as good as it goes. So if you want to evaluate it in a critical way, the European countries are acting quite submissive towards Trump, and that is their strategy of kind of keeping the peace.
This is an impromptu question, Fabian, but as you mentioned, Mr. Trump has reaffirmed the need for the US to control Denmark's Greenland. Do you see him pushing ahead with that mission? If that is the case, will this affect the NATO alliance?
Oh yeah, I mean, that would be really unforeseen. I mean, if he's really serious about that, I mean, I would say that would put a friction between Europe and the US that has not been there in the last century. I think that this would be an unprecedented case, and I don't expect it to happen. But I mean, Europe is very firm that, I mean, this we should not allow this to happen, and this would have catastrophic consequences, especially in terms of the remilitarization of Europe. I think then basically US would not be an ally of Europe anymore.
Meanwhile, Stephen, as you mentioned, Canada has announced its preferred bidder for its submarine project. The country chose the German company. Do tell us a bit more about this decision.
Well, this is, I believe, the biggest arms deal in Canadian history. And Carney, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, presented this, kind of thematically similar to what Fabian was just describing as the potential developments in the U.S.-NATO relationship. But he described this as a move to reduce not just reliance on the U.S. as a defense partner, but reducing commercial ties with U.S. defense companies. Carney said that it's been customary for U.S. companies to receive about 70% of Canada's arms budget, and the Prime Minister very deliberately wants to channel that money elsewhere. And so this could be, obviously the context here is that in his second term, Trump has said a lot of, unsavory things about Canada. He's talked about wanting to make Canada the 51st state. These are comments, as a Canadian myself, having grown up there, these are the kinds of things that are definitely going to displease most Canadians. The perception of the U.S. as being a kind of a condescending or disrespectful southern neighbor is something that has been a part of public discourse there for a long time. It's something that I grew up hearing about, and Carney has really staked a lot of his political capital on directly countering this and of being world leaders all over the world nowadays have this choice. Are you going to be obsequious to Trump? Are you going to flatter him? Or going to try to play up to him and hope that can kind of dull the edges of his aggressive tendencies? Or are you going to be more kind of confrontational? Or are you going to stand up? Carney has chosen the other. He came up with this slogan, elbows up. And kind of said that despite Canada being a much economically and population-wise a much smaller country, it nevertheless is a sizable economy, and it was going to take its business elsewhere, wherever it can. And so I know Canada's decision was a disappointment for Korea. Carney made sure to say that he had spoken with President Lee and that he understood the disappointment here, and he said that both the German bids and the Korean bids were very strong, very competitive, but they've decided to go in this direction. And I think it's this decision that probably most people in Canada see his logic, and it's probably a fairly popular decision.
Fabian, as we just said, Germany's TKMS has been tapped to build 12 submarines for Canada. What do you suppose are the broader implications of this decision for Germany, for South Korea?
Well, here in Korea, it was framed as a strategic decision that Germany is a NATO member country, the German bid had one advantage, namely interoperability. Those submarine systems, I mean, in the future, it could help that basically you have the same submarine systems, and there's a lot of more cooperation between NATO countries. So this strategic advantage was one that Germany had, but in terms of the bidding, I would say they were really head-on-head. It was a tight race, and what I found was the interesting story is that South Korea actually learned how to assemble and develop submarines based on German technology back in the days in the 1980s, actually by this exact shipyard in Kiel in northern Germany that now it was bidding against. And that shows the amazing development here in South Korea, that it learned from German technology. Now it's at least on the same level, you can say. And I think Lee Jae Myung, also the president here, reacted immediately, and he said that basically we didn't achieve the result we wanted, we didn't get the bidding, but we showed the world that we can compete, that we are really head-on-head with the leading submarine countries, and that we should just not let us bring down, but keep competing. And I think that's the right attitude. And of course, this is a setback for the defense industry here in South Korea, but not a big one. I think South Korea has benefited in terms of weapon sales a lot by recent developments, and from the German perspective, this was really one of the very few positive news for the country that has come out in the last weeks. Yeah.
Right, and speaking about shipbuilding, Stephen, this is an impromptu question. Major shipbuilders here in South Korea, they reportedly submitted requested information by the US with regard to the capabilities to build naval vessels, raising prospects for a potential partnership between the US and South Korea in shipbuilding itself. Do you see this partnership as boosting ties between the two countries? What merits are there for the Lee Jae Myung administration?
I think the two sides have a pretty strong consensus there that Trump is wanting to revive U.S.'s shipbuilding sector, and he sees South Korea as a more advanced and more capable in that area. And the U.S. has a lot of challenges when it comes to that. They don't have the workforce, they don't have the kind of very skilled yet inexpensive labor force that shipbuilding powers tend to have. And so I believe there's legal hurdles to that. Like I think there's U.S. laws that dictate that military vessels have to be constructed in the country, have to be led by American companies. But I think that's definitely an area where there's room to cooperate. But there's a lot of details need to be worked out. And I know that the Lee Jae Myung administration has really upheld shipbuilding as one of these kinds of signature industries, along with like semiconductors and defense, that they're really focusing on, and they're really pouring a lot of R&D power into, and a lot of state support. So I think there's reasons to expect further developments there.
Right, on that note, we'll end today's talk then. Stephen, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Fabian, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, that brings us to the end of this edition of Press Perspective. Thank you for watching. Do join us again same time tomorrow.